The history of the Métis Nation. French colonists were granted land charters as early as the 1620s around what is now Quebec City. The first colonists were diverse in their skills. Carpenters, missionaries, merchants, and fur trappers made the way with the incentive of the Company of 100 Associates. This company's mandate was to transport 4,000 settlers and supplies to New France by 1653. Unfortunately, war with England and the hazards of ocean travel made this endeavor difficult. In the end, only one successful voyage of 150 settlers made their home in what is now Quebec City. My ancestors, Gaspard Boucher and his son Pierre Boucher, held charter with the Company of 100 Associates in 1627 and voyaged to New France in 1635. Pierre Boucher was a Jesuit missionary at the Huron missions in Georgian Bay. Because of his familiarity with the indigenous languages, he was employed as a soldier in the garrison of Quebec City. In 1653, at Trois-Rivières, Pierre was distinguished for his role in defending an attack from the Iroquois and concluded a favorable peace treaty with the Iroquois nation. This eventually led to him being appointed governor of Trois-Rivières. Pierre Boucher founded Boucherville in 1667. Voyageurs, described as legendary, were transporters of fur and trade goods by canoe throughout most of North America. The push to discover new lands in the late 18th century, after the lands around the Great Lakes were depleted, created a need for the voyageurs. Tall tales glamorizing their lives are many, but in truth their days were arduous. 14-hour days paddling 40 to 60 strokes a minute, which equates to 4 to 6 miles an hour, and having to carry at least 2 90-pound packs of furs between portages, though they were responsible for typically 6 packs, having to take at least 3 trips between portage sites. At night they slept with their heads under the turned-over canoe to keep their heads dry from rain. What is most remembered about the voyageurs is their songs. They sang constantly to keep time with their strokes, to mark the passage of time, and some voyageurs were hired more for their singing voices than their abilities to pack loads or paddle. Voyageurs were not granted trade titles and were instead paid a meager wage. This resulted in most voyageurs working their entire adult lives well into their 60s. The custom at the time was to trade First Nation wives, sometimes leaving their wives with other voyageurs while they went traveling for work. The voyageurs are the fathers of the Métis, and the First Nations are the mothers. I have seen Canoe Sweet Promontory suddenly and burst upon my view, while at the same moment the wild romantic song of the voyageurs, as they plied their brisk paddles, struck upon my ear, and I have felt the thrilling enthusiasm caused by such a scene, when 30 or 40 of these picturesque canoes, half enshrouded in spray that flew from the bright vermilion paddles, with joyful hearts sang, with all the force of 300 manly voices, one of their lively airs. Robert Louis Stevenson. Canada was conquered by the British in 1763, shifting control of trade in the territories from French rule to British. The voyageurs were still much needed, but the cost of transporting supplies further west became too costly and took too much time. In what is now Winnipeg, large-scale production of pemmican was set up. Pemmican is bison meat and tallow mashed with berries and left to dry in the sun. Pemmican can last up to 2 years and is a calorie-rich food and is traditional food for the First Nations of the prairies. The need for bison meat increased the need for buffalo hunters, which drew Métis to the area. Unfortunately, the Hudson Bay Company, English-owned, and the Northwest Company, French-owned, were competing for dominance over the area. Most Métis spoke French and sided with the NWC, although some Métis were not eager to aid the requests of the NWC against the settlers of the area and the HBC. My ancestor, Charles Bottineau, refused to set the Hudson's Bay Company fort at Pembina River on fire in 1814. Bottineau and others were threatened by the company officials in August of 1816 that if they did not chase away and plunder the English, that they would be chased from the country. After much violence and bloodshed, the 2 companies were eventually joined in 1821. Founded in 1812 by Thomas Douglas, 5th Earl of Selkirk, the Red River Colony was a settlement on the Red and Assiniboine Rivers in what is now Manitoba and North Dakota. 185,000 kilometers square was gifted from the HBC to Lord Selkirk for settlement. Governor MacDonald arrived with Scottish settlers to the area in August, with a second group arriving in October. MacDonald tried to monopolize trade in the area, which led to heated exchanges and eventually the Battle of Seven Oaks between Métis, First Nations men, and Northwest Company members against members of the Hudson Bay Company. The exchange led to 20 of the HBC dead and only 1 casualty on the Métis side. With the need for buffalo meat and pelts surpassing the need for fur traders, men began shifting occupations from voyageurs to buffalo hunters. Unfortunately, winter on the prairies is incredibly harsh and almost impossible to survive. The Red River settlement was an ideal place, in river valleys that offered shelter from winter storms and provided water year-round. From the beginning, there was little involvement from the Canadian government, leading the settlers to stake their own land claims. The Métis built their homes on what they called rangs, typically 800 feet wide and about 2 miles long. Each rangs was built on the riverfront with their homes and gardens built close to the river. Towards the back of the lands, they held commons, land that was commonly used between families for grazing, foraging, and as woodlots. In the summer, hunters would leave their settlements and families behind to hunt the buffalo on the prairies. The introduction of horses to North America did little to change the nomadic lifestyles of the First Nations peoples of the prairies. Most were reluctant to ride horses, but instead used them to carry supplies and eventually pull carts. The Métis buffalo hunters were famous for their use of the Red River carts, one-axle carts pulled by horses and made of wood. As there was nothing to aid in the friction of the axle turning, they were incredibly loud. It is said you could hear the carts coming from up to 2 miles away. Like their voyager forefathers, the buffalo hunters were known to travel huge distances from Red River all the way across Canada and down into what is now Montana. By 1878, America's buffalo extermination program was in full effect. America was trying to starve the Indians off the land, and very little buffalo remained. By 1851, the Métis, known for their shooting skills and military discipline, were pushing further and further into Sioux territories. The Métis were always vigilant for any kind of skirmish, but the size of the Métis hunting parties and their allegiance to other tribes in the area typically deterred the Sioux from starting conflict. Until a large hunting party of 318 hunters and 1,300 camp followers, mostly women and children, encountered a Sioux host of more than 8,000. The Sioux, so sure of victory, they taunted the Métis, trying to provoke them to scatter. Instead, the Métis went into military defense mode, circling their carts and digging protective pits, vowing to fight to the death. After 2 days of intense fighting, the Sioux eventually withdrew, giving honor to the Métis and acknowledging them as masters of the plains. At this battle was my ancestor, Gabriel Dumont. He was 13 years old. By 1830, the Métis were split between the nomadic plains and farmers settled in the Red River. In 1836, Lord Selkirk's family sold back the land of the Red River settlement to the HBC. The HBC held a monopoly on the land, and as the only adjudicators in the area, any claims against the company were treated as a conflict of interest and usually went unheard, or if they were heard, would only favor a positive outcome for the company. This led to Métis being prosecuted for misusing the land. Land claims with Selkirk were unacknowledged by the company. The Métis protested against the company's monopoly, but legally the monopoly remained. 1869 saw the order of the Red River Land Survey by the Dominion government. Anticipating the transfer of lands from HBC to Canada, William McDougall ordered the survey of the land. But as was earlier pointed out, the colonizers did not acknowledge the commons of the rangs and instead marked them as vacant. This was worrisome for the Métis as their established homesteads and way of life were in jeopardy. In November 1869, Louis Riel mounted a resistance of Métis against the transfer of Rupert's Land, owned by the HBC, to Britain's Canada. The resistance prevented McDougall's land survey party from entering the colony. A new government was promised with elected Métis representation, but the Métis suspected rightly that this was a false promise. Under Riel's leadership, the Métis began to draft a list of rights which would apply to everyone in the colony, with no exclusions and the right to public governance, not just Métis governance. However, the list of rights would never be recognized by Canadian government officials, and though it did bring the English and French Métis together, it didn't do much else. As tensions in the area grew, the Métis people now recognized Riel as their leader. With the creation of the territory of Manitoba in 1870, Métis land titles were guaranteed. However, the size of the land was limited and was mismanaged by later governments. Riel and his associates were deemed outlaws and were exiled from the territory. Although there was a bounty on his head, Riel decided to run for Member of Parliament in October 1873, but because of the bounty, he was convinced to abdicate his seat to his opponent Cartier. Cartier died shortly after being elected, and Riel won the next by-election in February 1874. This time he decided to symbolically take his seat in Ottawa. Although he made his presence no secret, he was never caught, even when he was snuck into Parliament and took his oath. The Register had no idea who he was until Riel signed his name. Before the clerk could do anything about Riel's presence, Riel was whisked away to Montreal. Parliament was outraged and immediately requested a by-election, which Riel again won. The lands of Northern America had changed dramatically. The First Nations had been pushed onto territories and reservations that were not their traditional lands. An influx of white settlers had taken over settlements and were creating new settlements on prairies. The buffalo were wiped out and First Nations people were starving. Although people were trying to help the First Nations, including Gabriel Dumont, complaints of how bad the First Nations were being treated fell on deaf ears. Prime Minister MacDonald's answer was to send in more police, especially as others were warning of a Métis and Indian uprising. Riel had retreated to America to avoid the bounty on his head, but in 1884 he returned. Even though Riel was a wanted man and was painted a pony stealer or worse by colonizers, in truth Riel always preached peace. He believed in fair representation by government officials, and in November 1884 was influential in the creation of a Bill of Rights for the Métis in the Northwest. Unfortunately, the Canadian government did nothing and decided in January to investigate only a small portion of Métis land claims. Again, Riel tried to make the government listen to the Métis by creating a revolutionary Bill of Rights in 1885, and again the government did nothing. Frustrated, the Métis began to make plans. In the spring of 1885, the Métis occupied the community of Duck Lake. Although the colonizers were gathering over 5,000 troops from eastern Canada, Ontario, and Quebec, only about 100 Northwest Mounted Police were near Duck Lake. The confrontation between the two parties quickly went from shared words to shared bullets with casualties on both sides. At the end of March, another skirmish resulted in heavy losses on the side of the police, while the Métis only lost 4 men. The Northwest Mounted Police decided to wait weeks for reinforcement, and it wasn't until May that the fate of the Métis was decided. In the end, the colonizers and police won the Battle of Atoche. The police had superior firepower, and Riel was forced to surrender on May 15, 1885. Gabriel Dumont escaped to Montana, while Riel was convicted of high treason and sentenced to death. Although his case was appealed 3 times, Riel was hung on November 16, 1885 in Regina. A huge portion of Métis did not participate in the resistance of 1885, and so this was not the end for the Métis people. Gabriel Dumont lived in America for the majority of the rest of his life. He traveled the states giving political talks before giving up politics and joining Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, where he was titled a desperado and a crack shot. He eventually returned to Canada, where he was reunited with his wife and died of heart failure in 1906. Today, Métis are recognized under the Canadian Constitution, but are not recognized under the Canadian Indian Act. Therefore, the Métis do not have the same rights as the First Nations in Canada, even though the Métis have always recognized themselves as a nation with their own language and identities. All the Métis ever wanted was recognition, rights, and freedoms, and they were willing to fight to the death for it. Controversy surrounds the Métis identity. Some claim that if they have a drop of First Nations blood, then they are Métis. However, these claims do not recognize the history of the Red River settlements and the history of a shared nation. The Canadian government does not recognize most Métis organizations federally and instead leaves it up to provincial organizations to make rules and divide funding to their people. For the Métis Nation BC, you have to prove lineage going back to at least 1909. As awareness of Indigenous issues grows, so does awareness of false claims of Indigenous ancestry and racist ideas of what makes an Indigenous person. The voice of the First Nations are rising, and hopefully reconciliation is coming.